Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you're joining us from today. Sounded a little bit like the Truman Show. I promise you it is most certainly not, and you have joined this evening for tonight's discussion for LawTech.Live. My name is Desi Vlahos. I'm absolutely thrilled to be moderating tonight's discussion. A big thank you also to Nick Watson and Rasmit Chadia for passing the reins over to me to chair this session. As you know, tonight's session has been rescheduled, and we appreciate you moving your time and your calendars to be part of it. Today we have a dynamic duo, if I can say so myself, joining us all the way from the northern and the southern hemispheres for tonight's discussion on wellness as a catalyst for ethical leadership, culture and sustainable future of the legal profession. But before I introduce you to our panellists this evening, I did want to set the tone a little bit and provide you with some context around tonight's discussion and what we're really trying to achieve in our discussion this evening. We know that work is the driving force and the centre of our economies. It's the core of our Business Council for Sustainable Development vision for 2050, and it's also essential for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Employers, their stakeholders and regulators are placing great focus on the link between lawyer wellbeing and business profitability, but also sustainability. We know that employee mental health and wellbeing is therefore becoming a strategic business priority and also a core part of responsible business. The problem is, it's not always clear how wellbeing fits into ESG strategy, and tonight we'll be really dissecting that carefully in our discussion. Also, many arguments for ethical business have tended to focus heavily on the upside of risk prevention. And what I mean by that is avoiding the possibility of regulatory investigation or reputational scandal. So given that lawyers are held to the highest ethical standards, the question is, are they therefore the ethical gatekeepers? And should they pave the way in their commitment to ethical practices and also through their leadership, including what measuring most? So tonight's session is going to look to address this question, look at purpose, culture, and how health, safety, and wellbeing are levers for ethical leadership. And in doing so, we hope to provide you with some clearer direction. The goal today is, in whatever your role is in the legal profession, that you come away with something, a new idea, a fresh perspective, perhaps even a new strategy that you can apply not only to be more successful, but more sustainable in your practice as well. So in terms of the format this evening, I'm going to give you just a quick idea of what to expect. I'm going to introduce the panellists to you in just a moment and tell you a little bit about their background in the industry. I'm then going to kick off the conversation, ask you with some questions, draw out some of the high-level themes and some of the trends and some of the considerations for you to take away that we should be thinking about. And then towards the end of the session, we'll open up the floor, give you an opportunity to ask some specific questions that you've been thinking about to help you navigate some of the upcoming opportunities, but also challenges. We like to keep this fairly casual this evening, so please feel free to unmute yourself. Actually, you probably can't. I might have to do that for you, but if you pop your hand up as well, I'll be able to unmute you and definitely join in the conversation. We'd love to see your face. Does that sound good for everyone? Hopefully yes, it is. So let's dive into the panel introductions, and I'm going to graciously talk to you a little bit about Dan and Julio, who are joining us. So Dan is the General Counsel at Network Rail. He's been with them for almost 16 years now with extensive private practice and in-house background. He leads a talented group of people and prioritises his team at every juncture. Recruiting, developing and empowering great people has been the foundation of team success within the business and allowed them to build a reputation externally as one of the most progressive in-house legal functions around. Now, very notably in 2019, Dan started the O-Shaped Lawyer Initiative, which has brought together leaders from across the legal industry with one core purpose: to make the legal profession better for those who are in it, for those who use it, and for those who are entering it. And I love the sound of that very much so, Dan. Focused on transforming the training and development of lawyers from universities all the way to leadership positions in law firms and in-house. The O-Shaped Lawyer is all about making a difference. I did want to sort of point out a little bit about you too, Dan, that you were selected as one of the Legal Business Magazine's in-house Rising Stars for 2014 and shortlisted for the GC of the Year at the Lawyers Awards in 2019. So it's lovely to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And just one quick addition to that, I did leave Network Rail short recently, so now focus on solely on pushing O-Shape forward. So that's the only addition I would make, but thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dan. Now, Julio is the Senior Manager of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at Clayton Utes and responsible for the strategic development and management of health, safety, wellbeing in Sydney in Australia. He's also experienced consulting professional with more than 12 years of health, safety and wellbeing management. He's got a degree in human movement, master's in occupational health and safety, and an exemplar global accredited lead auditor in integrated management systems. He's also the chartered member of the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management and sits on the committee of the Health Benefits of Good Work signatory working group and functional lead of the Corporate Mental Health Alliance. I think there's even more there, Julio, but I think in the interest of time, we'll probably cut it there. But suffice to say, you are a subject matter expert on all things health, safety and wellbeing. So it's great to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Desi. I'm honoured to be part of today's panel with Dan. I think hearing Dan's intro, I feel a little bit probably not as experienced as Dan. So I'm looking forward to hearing everything Dan has to say tonight.
Funny, I just thought the same when I heard your introduction, Julio. So we're both in the same place there.
I think we can have a Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer moment here and acknowledge that we're going to be nice and vulnerable this evening. So perfect platform for it. So it's great to have you on this panel session tonight. So, well, let's kick off the discussion and talk a little bit. I thought we'd talk a little bit about work to start with. So we know that work is the engine and it's really the engine at the centre of our economies. The average person will spend a third of their lifetime at work. So I thought we'd start off with you, Dan. I'd love to hear from you. Can you tell us a little bit about what effect work has on our wellbeing? So what really, like if we're looking at the culture piece, if we're looking at the quality of the workplace, tell us how it is and what it looks like and what the effect work has on our wellbeing.
So simply, it has a significant effect on our well-being. But I, for some time, have been trying to challenge the myth that it's about work-life balance. It's something I've never been particularly comfortable with because it does suggest you are either at work doing something you don't want to be doing, but when fortunately at the end of the day or week you leave work, you have your life. And I think the reality is that people are talking much more about work-life integration so that you have a whole life experience. And therefore, what happens at work impacts on your experience, well-being and health outside of work. And the same applies vice versa, so that whatever's going on at home will impact your performance at work. There's no doubt. And I think we're starting to recognize, I hope we are, that we need to start looking at the whole person, not simply separating out someone that comes to work and is acting in one way compared to someone at home. It's very different. So this whole idea of bring yourself to work is something that will contribute to better well-being, because we're not pretending to be something that we're not, which is incredibly exhausting and will no doubt contribute to worse overall health. Then you look at the legal profession, and particularly in the UK, but I'm sure this is the same around the world, it's very much been, for new people entering it, a really significant change in a chapter in their life. And therefore they feel that we have to now put to one side all that makes us who we are in order to now put this professional persona on. And so when people come in and look at these incredible offices that Big Law have, the highly esteemed lawyers that lead the firms, my instinct is that people then put a very different mask on when they're in the workplace in order to believe they need to up their level of professionalism. That for me contributes to people finding it much more difficult because they're no longer being themselves, they're no longer authentic, and that's exhausting. So work can have a huge impact both while people are there, but also that will carry on into people's home life and their family lives and their friends' lives. So we need to start recognizing people as a whole person, work being part of that, not separate out work life when it used to be the case that people would clock in and clock out of a workhouse and finally, unfortunately, switch off from work until the next day. The reality now, I think, is very different.
And look, you make a very good point when you say that, because we're in this hybrid style of working now. So as you rightly say, we're not really clocking off. Our work is very much at our homes now, and really creating those boundaries is what a lot of professionals are going to be struggling with. I do like that you pointed out, and I'm very much agree with you. I've never been a fan of work-life balance, because I think what it does is it really suggests that work is a thief of our precious time, and what we should be enjoying. And I do like the term integration, as you've said. Sometimes I use harmony as well, but it's finding that nice integration where we're going to get meaning and purpose out of our work, as we should rightly be doing. Julio, I'd like to hear from you as well now, from a sort of health safety perspective as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the actual sort of the health safety lens behind that, and how work impacts our well-being, and then what is the role of business in protecting and promoting health and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Dan, especially I think as we go to the new ways of working, as the terminology is following the pandemic, integration is key. And I tend to take a bit of a lens that, historically, the safety profession has viewed workplace as a workplace well-being, which relates to all aspects of working life, from the quality and the safety of the physical environment to how workers feel about their work and their working environment, the climate at work and the work organisation in itself. And the aim of, the measures for workplace well-being is to complement health safety measures to ensure workers or employees are safe, healthy and satisfied and engaged at work. And for this approach to take place, it needs to be integrated into the fabric of the organisation, in the way the work we do and the people we work with. Now, as Dan rightly pointed, 100% agree, the mental health or the health of workers can be affected both negatively or positively by workplace culture, the way business manages the different work-related risks and opportunities that employees face at work. And this includes both external influences, which can stem from obviously the way in which the business operates, the regulatory environment, and also to an extent the labour market. Whether there's a demand or I guess if there's not enough employees to actually service the work that's coming through. But in addition to that, the type of work that's being done, for example, if they're working on vicarious or traumatic and distressing material. But then in the same way, internal organisational factors can enable or undermine mentally healthy work. This can be dictated by the availability of financial resources, the number of staff, the systems and the infrastructure within the organisation. And while maturity and culture can shape risk tolerance and the quality of the resources, these resources are including, for example, leadership, skills and capability, management systems, policies and practices, and ultimately interpersonal relationships. So I think the combination of both external and internal risks and resources create a context unique to organisations, and protecting workers' overall health, both physical and mental, and promoting mentally healthy work means understanding the context of the organisation and how could it actually affect the health of your employees, and then responding appropriately in relation to that. So I think coming from a safety lens, and we'll probably touch upon this a little bit later, some health and safety professionals have probably been a bit concerned of, health, safety and wellbeing coming from a sustainability more to a social element under the ESG. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to leverage the executive leadership team and really focus on those key elements that cause or potentially can contribute to poor mental ill health within the workplace, which is around the design of work.
So what I'm gathering from both of your comments then is that work can then be a direct contributor to poor physical and mental health, really, if it's not managed well. So at the same time, though, and I think it's really important to point out the fact that work can also be leveraged then to drive significant positive health impacts. And I think that's what a lot of the focus is, through fostering those safe workplaces and cultures that are going to then protect and nurture the wellbeing of its employees. So on that point then, sorry, I'm going to shoot back to Julio on that, then I want to ask Dan a question. In terms of the actual role of business in protecting and promoting it, I mean, I know there's been in Australia a lot of confusion about what organisations should be doing. We've seen a lot of changes recently in terms of regulatory changes. In the legal profession, we've tended to see it fall on the shoulders of the individual. And I know historically, workplace wellbeing has tended to be managed broadly by HR departments or not at all. So really, like, what is the responsibility, sort of from that particular lens? What is the responsibility of the organisation to the individual? And when we're looking at shared responsibilities, I mean, whose responsibility is it exactly to manage wellbeing?
I think it's a shared responsibility. So the basic requirement is for employers or businesses to prevent harm to workers or to employees, and that's including both physical and psychological harm. And that essentially reflects the primary duty that exists under WHS requirements here within Australia, but also under the HSE requirements within the UK. And again, globally, most countries tend to have whether it's an Occupational Health and Safety Act regulation, in which the primary duty of care is to prevent harm to your employees or anyone that's impacted by your undertakings. And that responsibility sits both at, I guess, across the board, from officers of the organisation, senior leaders, managers, and also employees themselves have an obligation to ensure that they're not putting themselves or anyone else in danger as a result of reckless endangerment. So there is a responsibility and accountability that goes across the board. However, when it comes to obviously beginning to address mental well-being or well-being within the workplace, putting the responsibility onto employees for them to try and address their own health, whilst they have a responsibility to that, I tend to use the analogy of when it comes to fishes in a pond. If the pond is dirty, your fishes will get sick. You can take them out, they recover, but if you throw them back into that same dirty pond, they're going to continue getting sick and they're not going to be able to recover. So similar in that sense, it's then looking at what is the environment, understanding the context of your organisation, both the environmental factors and the organisational factors that can impact the overall health and well-being of your employees. And if we go into those psychological hazards, those can also take in multiple different aspects, both around role ambiguity or role conflict, not understanding what is required from you as an employee, high workload, low workload, low job control, elements of bullying, harassment and violence and discrimination, poor management and supervision and support. So I guess historically, most organisations have understand it from a physical context. If you're operating a machinery, to reduce the likelihood of harm, you put a guard on place. Similar to that, you don't then go tell them, go get more physically stronger, because they can't control the element of what's occurring within the workplace. They obviously have an element which they can obviously support, but if they don't have the supports within the workplace to help them achieve that, then essentially you're kind of getting a roadblock, or there's a barrier to success.
Yes, and that analogy you just used as well was something that really stuck with me. I remember for the first time when I heard that analogy in physical, obviously the protection through physical safety, by saying that, I'd like you to lift all of those boxes in the corner, but I'm not going to give you a lifting aid. You're going to need to go to the gym to build your muscles and be more resilient. So if you're sort of drawing that analogy across, you're rightly sort of acknowledging the fact that they don't have that latitude or that decision-making power to be able to do that. Well, obviously that's not going to work. So the organisation then needs to ensure that they're putting in place the right safeguards to either resource it or to assist the individual then. So that's a really interesting point that you make there as well. Dan, we know that there's a great report out called the Healthy People, Healthy Business report that said that supporting employee health and wellbeing is critical to businesses, and failing to act presents a number of legal, moral, reputational, but also operational risks. But on the other hand, proactive and innovative engagement can also generate a wide range of opportunities, but also benefits. Could you, talk to some of those risks that are, that we might see through some of the businesses as well, and then the other end of it as well, what would it look like in terms of that proactive, innovative engagement that could then generate those opportunities and benefits for organisations?
Yeah, of course, and I'll follow on what Julio was saying really about this obvious, split between what people see as a physical well-being and safety as opposed to the psychological or mental health. I mean, I, until very recently, worked in an organisation that was a massive engineering organisation with huge safety risks every day of the week for thousands of people on the front line. And safety was the number one priority. And our overall safety message was about everyone home safe every day. Now, it wasn't everyone home safe and well or healthy every day. It was all about, physical safety. Now, that's not to say in any way that there wasn't a real focus on mental well-being, but it certainly wasn't until very recently when we brought someone in specially to address it and look after it and do a phenomenal job of driving the change through. It wasn't something that featured compared to the physical element. So across the organization, people were asked to start team meetings with this for many years and have a safety moment at all teams meetings. And this is across 45,000 people organization. That was to discuss something around the organization that they'd seen or heard or could contribute to, so that everyone had that on their mind. Now, in our own team, in a legal function, talking about safety, after a while got a bit dull. They would talk about driving your car safely to the office, or you'd talk about making sure our office space was clear of any clutter. The reality is we started to move it, of course, to now much more about our well-being moment. So that at the start of every meeting, we would check in on people. We would understand whether anyone had not even a personal thing, but something that they could bring in from experience elsewhere to start to really help the conversation to flow, to recognize that particularly for us, the bigger health and well-being risk wasn't safety. It was much more about our mental health. So there are things that people can do to bring them to the top of the conversation in a much more preventative way.
And could you share some of those with us? Yeah, that would be great if you could share.
So I think the conversation point is a real key. Start to bring it to life on team agendas. We ran a series of pilots for O-Shaped, and I can share more about those as we go through. But the idea was that we brought private practice lawyers together with their in-house clients, and they worked on a range of the attributes that O-Shaped talks about: communication, collaboration, courage, feedback. And every other week for 6 months, they met for an hour to talk about things that weren't work. When it came to what resilience and adaptability was about, the message that came out of those 7 pilots very clearly was well-being is top of the agenda. Now, that I think was quite heartwarming to see, because I think there's a recognition, certainly from individuals, that their own priority is their health. But if that isn't supported by an environment where people feel safe enough, psychologically safe enough, to share with the leaders that they're struggling, and in a profession that is still very outdated and very traditional, being able to share openly, particularly if you're junior, but being able to share openly that you're struggling mentally is something I would imagine most people would choose not to do. Certainly in my own experience, I was in big law 20 years ago, a bit less, and I went through my own struggles with my own well-being. I had no idea it was mental health at that point, because that was well before people talked about it in the context we're describing it now. But when I eventually did pluck up the courage to start talking to someone and say, I'm struggling, it was clear to me that the partners involved were perfectly polite to my face, but wouldn't then give me the work going forward that made any real difference. So eventually it was the start of the end for me. But certainly with that partner, I ended up moving and working for someone else. But the reality is it was not spoken about. And I think there is still probably a real a taboo still for people to raise these issues. And I think we need to be much more open. So the conversation point, making it normal in the same way that you would make it normal if someone came in with a broken arm to talk about it, making it normal to have these conversations, I think is the starting point.
No, look, and I completely agree with you, Dan.
Yeah, it's still a taboo, and I get that, right? You know, we've got people coming into the profession who have had a huge academic success. They've always done things really well, been top of the class, been the one everyone's looked up to, and all of a sudden they come into an environment where they're surrounded by brilliantly intelligent people, and maybe they're not the cleverest anymore, and it starts to impact on whether they doubt themselves, whether they should be where they are, the classic imposter syndrome, whether you believe that's a syndrome or just a thing. Let's be honest, people all sit around like Julio and I did with each other and said, you're far more experienced than me. And so people feel that has an impact over a period of time. And I don't feel at the moment that there is enough opportunity or culturally the right environment for people to share. So I know I've spoken for quite a long time about creating the environment where people feel comfortable enough to share. But for me, that's critical. Now, I've probably gone well off the question you were asking, Desi, but...
No, I actually wanted to come back to that, Dan, because you're touching on a really good point. And I was listening into a session of early in career lawyers, and really they're looking at trying to empower them with the ability to be able to set boundaries. And I think that's really important, because it really is going to come from the tone that's set at the top. So the ability to be able to speak openly about capacity, or to raise issues in relation to wellbeing, or when they're at really whether they're not coping, and have that psychological safety, as you pointed out, to be able to voice these concerns. And I think very much we can speak about these things, but unless the tone is set from the top and modelled by leadership, then unfortunately it's very difficult for them to be able to do that without repercussions, as you probably experienced however many years ago that you experienced that unfortunate situation where some of the work was being withheld from you at one point in time.
But I would add to this, Desi, because I've been in a position as a leader where someone in my team has gone off unwell with stress, and I thought I was genuinely a compassionate leader that cared for people. Yeah. So you can't control everything, but you can just create the environment where people feel that they can talk about it, and that is a starting point. I think that people, leaders or not, genuinely do not want their people to fall over. They're just simply not trained. They've not got the capability to be able to spot the signs, have the conversation. You know, can you imagine? And I'd love to think every big law firm would just take an hour a month to bring their teams together to talk about well-being. It would not damage the business at all. In fact, it would have a massive benefit, because all of a sudden you would start to get people feeling comfortable and safer where they are. And you would find that as a result of that, engagement increases, motivation increases, discretionary effort increases. I'd love to start seeing that, because it would start to change the environment. Generally come back to this position. Leaders do not want their people to fall over. So how can we help them help their people?
And that's exactly right. It's about making a start. It's not about saying, well, I don't know how to do it, so I put my hands up. It's about, making a concerted effort. What is interesting, and you did point out something about a lot of leaders not having the training. The IBA Wellbeing Task Force, our report that was commissioned as a result of the surveys, actually showed that only about 16 to 17% of people in positions of management actually had any kind of wellbeing training. So we can see there's an issue. The Deloitte report into the C-suite also actually said and reinforced a lot of this, this information about what we already know. But even talking about it, as you rightly said, once a month coming together would actually probably assist our leaders who also need the support as well. They're completely under-resourced at the moment, under the pump, and they also need assistance in this regard too, which might even give them a break and the possibility to take some respite periods.
Yeah.
Julio, do you want to add to that? And then we'll jump over to the next question.
Yes, Dan, did you want to add anything last minute? Sorry?
No, I'll come in, Julio, afterwards. No, go on, you go for it, and I'll come in.
No, definitely. I think what was interesting is that element of, as when we're on an airline, you have to put your own face mask first before being able to put on the face mask of someone else. So that leadership piece is so important because we need our leaders to be able to look after themselves, to be able to then look after their employees to ensure that they continue to thrive. And I think, from my approach, when it comes to healthy work, there's probably 5 key elements that stick out, and one being trust, and that's being able to welcome bad news, actively and consistently prioritizing safety and well-being to demonstrate that it's a primary, organizational goal or team goal, similar to what Dan was saying. Communication, I think the element of promoting cooperation, inspiring, and fostering group goals and providing individualized support to foster, that the quality interaction between leaders and employees is critical. And that's where I think that communication piece can sometimes come undone or get where employees can become stuck. And that kind of goes into the other element of the varieties of human work, of how work is done, how work is imagined, how work is disclosed, and how work is prescribed. And how work is disclosed, there's always that element of fear of consequence as a result of, am I doing the work the way it's supposed to be done and how I've been directed to do so? Therefore, you might have a partner or a leader that's genuine and interested in understanding how are you coping, but because there's that, whether they're new to the team or they might have a fear of speaking out, that they may not disclose how they're coping, and that then becomes a flow-on effect, and that again, probably jumping into another different area there, that speak up, it's, telling people to speak up is not as easy as just saying that you need to speak up. There's obviously other factors that come into play within, whether it's authoritative bias as a result of your upbringing in relation to that. Right. But going back to my 5 elements, the other 3 I was going to say is, achieving the achievable, ensuring that key element that Dan was talking to is having the expertise and the skills and capability. But the other last bit is having that visible leadership, being on the ground, getting out, looking around, but not doing it in the way to try and police. It's more about getting in there, leading by example, and having those vulnerable conversations to kind of create that authenticity.
So it really is about that's exactly right, creating that environment, as you're saying, Dan.
Yeah,
where we can come together. That's right.
Sorry, Desi, I didn't mean to talk over you. I just think, just this point, we shouldn't be, in the same way as I always think that lawyers shouldn't, we talk about technology, shouldn't need to be experts in coding. I don't think we're expecting our leaders to be psychologists when it comes to asking the questions. So there are very simple techniques that people can adopt. One of them is asking their team regularly, how are you? I know it sounds incredibly brand new, wacky and wild. Simply asking. And I heard someone, a specialist similar to Julio at one point say in some training we had, was saying, always ask a second time, because the first time is always fine. I'm okay, fine. Always ask a second time. So there's a simple one that everyone can and should be doing all the time just to get below that surface. But similarly, I think there is an individual responsibility to make sure that people are being as open as they can be about it. No one else is going to be able to start solving the problem or bring it to life. So I think we talked about being shared responsibility. It is, but let's give people the confidence and capabilities in leadership to be able to ask the right questions. We're not there to diagnose their health. We're there to be able to ensure they are supported and they have the right help if and when it's needed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's funny you say you asked them twice. I've got a good strategy that I use, Dan. I actually say out of 10. So, because in Australia, there's a sentiment in Australia where someone says, how are you going? And the other person always says, good, thanks. Like no one ever, that's how you're supposed to respond. So sometimes even asking out of 10 is a way to nicely sort of triage or to determine, how they're sort of faring in any given day, and then open up that dialogue to what's gone on for them. And I find that's really, really effective too. But you're exactly right in what you say. It's not the employer's responsibility. It ultimately is the employer's responsibility to ensure the environment is going to be such that it's conducive to people speaking out or to raising concerns without fear of any repercussion or it affecting their careers or livelihood, because that's what ultimately is going to lead into that psychological safety. But I do need to move on to this. So if we're looking at, I know you wanted to add there something, Julio. We could take this, keep talking about this underwater. I did want to talk a little bit about risks, because we've talked about the individual. We've talked about the shared responsibility. We know what the employer has to do. In Australia, we're seeing lots of regulatory changes, but also we've got the individual's responsibility. And even from an ethical perspective as well, individuals also sort of need to shake a leg to some extent too and acknowledge that when they're not coping as well, they also need to sort of put their hand up and say, well, I'm at capacity. I need some help here as well, because there are ethical issues. There was a report in Australia back in 2009 that actually connected about 80% of disciplinary matters having mental health concerns at their core. So we do also need to make sure we're not adopting this martyr type persona. And we are actually saying that and seeking the help when it's available through your EAP or through whoever and whatever resources are available. From an organisational perspective, though, Julio, can you tell us what some of the risks are and what actions can be taken to safeguard people and organisations from these? So, in terms of the legal, the moral, perhaps even the reputational risks to organisations for not actually, paying attention to well-being of their people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes to a couple of key points there. Several key drivers. What are the drivers for, ensuring the health and safety of your employees? And, first one obviously is the legislative requirement. There's a reputational impact as a result of failing to be able to provide a safe working environment. We've seen that countless over the last year and over the last decade, organisations that failed to, whether it is as a result of sexual harassment incidents that have come out or as a result of lack of environmental governance that's taken place based on the context of the impact that's had on the stock market, There's obviously the moral, ethical argument, cultural and performance and financial consequences as a result of different insurances elements. But I think for me, the key aspect that comes to it is understanding the context of the organization and looking at where your pain points are, both from high frequency, low severity, and also high frequency, low severity, but low severity, high frequency. I think I got those all the way right? Way around.
So you need to distill that for us, because that's a bit too much health, safety, wellbeing language for me. So tell me what that means when you mean high frequency, low severity, and in relation to what exactly?
It's predominantly looking at your incidences. So what are the data points that you're able to understand and distill and interpret? And the most classical one that most safety professionals is looking at your lost time injuries or your hazard incidences. Or injuries, illnesses that are taking place. So, we all experience injury and illnesses within the organisations as a result of their undertakings. But understanding, are those as a result, are we having high frequency of those particular injury or incidences that are taking place? And are they also high severity? Or are we having low frequency, but the incidents that we are experiencing are of high severity? Therefore, that gives you a starting point as to where do we need to begin focusing. And sometimes, and with especially coming to the aspect of social impact or more broadly health and well-being, where do you start? And sometimes it's just too hard.
Where do you start? Yeah.
And sometimes it's too hard. Therefore, people just put it in the too hard basket and hopefully it'll take care of itself. And we can focus on other key elements. And I mean, for us, it was, within the organization, we needed to understand, we knew with what was occurring within the community here in Australia, that across the professional service sectors firms, there was 1 in 5 individuals experiencing mental health illness at some point in their career. And in the legal profession, we know that prevalence is a lot higher, 1 in 3. So to understand that prevalence, we needed to take a look at the contributing factors, both the environmental influences, as well as the personality features and traits of lawyers that we typically see within the profession. So the key area of focus for what's under our influence and within our control is looking at the element of the working environment, which can go into that good work design or work design. And that was looking at, the factors of high workload, fast-paced working environment, constant pressure to perform. Lawyers naturally have a bit of a negative cognitive bias because we are looking out for the risk for our clients and trying to mitigate that risk for our clients.
Julio, is that what sorry, just to stop you there, when you're saying that negative cognitive bias, are you referring to what Seligman once referred to as that pessimistic explanatory style? Is it that sort of you're always trying to preempt when something could go wrong and that can be maladaptive? Is that
yes,
the
definitely.
suggestion there?
Yeah, that's the suggestion. But then, the other elements of vicarious trauma or our people assisting people during stressful times. So within that, we needed to understand, okay, what is the frequency, the duration of exposure to those hazards or those workplace factors in which our employees are experiencing, and begin putting in appropriate measures of support or control measures to mitigate the likelihood of an injury, illness, or an incident taking place along that line. Now, that being said, not all controls are going to always eliminate. And when it comes to, from a health and safety perspective, we look at the hierarchy of control, which goes from eliminate all the way down to administrative controls, looking at PPE. Now, within the context of psychological hierarchy of control, we can't eliminate the work.
Yes.
Yeah, we can't eliminate the work because essentially we're a business, we need to operate. And if we, told our clients we're not going to do that work, then essentially we're obviously not going to be a profitable business. Therefore, I'm not going to be able to continue to work. So the way that I tend to approach it is I adapt the NIOSH total worker health hierarchy of control. And that kind of goes into the principles of good work design. Now, here in Australia, if we look at the aspects of good works design, it's defined by the regulator, as being concerned with specifying and organising existing and new jobs and tasks of a work group or individual to be less hazardous and minimise harm from physical and psychological hazards and risks. So, again, that probably sounds a bit of like a mouthful when talking about it, but if you're looking at the hierarchy of control, it's looking at those elements of what is the work our employees are doing and doing a bit of a task analysis to understand the tasks that our employees are doing on a day-to-day basis, looking at the frequency and the exposure that they have and leveraging that to understand the likelihood and the consequence of the work that's been undertaken by our employees on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, again, I could probably more than happy to share it afterwards. If you look at the element of eliminate those working conditions that threaten health and safety and well-being for employees, enhancing some of those policies and procedures further down the line. But probably where I would always start and where we tend to focus on, how can we redesign the working environment for safety, health, and well-being of our employees? So how do we design work to actually leverage those health factors of good work design? Which is not easy because...
Sorry. Well, of course it's not easy, but I mean, good work is good for us. So how do we do it? How do we actually design it so it's going to be conducive to good mental health and well-being ultimately as well? And, looking at the way work is designed, the workforce, but also the workplace through what you've raised is very important there as well. Dan, did you want to add to that at all, or did you have something to say just then?
No, I'm just thinking what a fabulous kind of outline that Julio's provided, and for me every day is a school day, so I've learned a lot there already, right? And I would say you just touched on it, Desi, there, this idea of work can be a really positive influence on your whole life, and finding the right purpose and meaning in the work that you're doing has a real impact on your well-being. Now, it's a real issue for us again in the profession, because we're seeing more and more the younger generation coming in looking for organizations that will address their desire to be somewhere with the right values, with a purpose that they can really attach themselves to. And for in-house lawyers, that's much easier because they can join organizations that they care about the purpose, they care about the values. And those values and purpose really should be lived and breathed throughout that organization if that organization is authentic. For law firms, it's very hard for them to really inspire in their people a purpose that people want to attach themselves to or follow. Because really, what is the purpose? Yes, there are fabulous purpose statements out there that talk about, making a difference to the world with our advice or whatever it might be. But the reality, if you ask most clients, the purpose of law firms is to make money. Now,
we've had this discussion, that's right.
and so if that's the case, how do you attach yourselves and get people in who are genuinely passionate about the work they do, and that will contribute to better well-being? It's really hard. So it comes back to those organizations who I think are talking about well-being a lot more. I think they are starting to recognize that, whether it's cynical on my part that there is a business benefit in making sure that people are healthy and well and they're not losing people to sickness absence, because that's expensive, or having to replace people who are burnt out because that's expensive, or whether it's because genuinely there is a care for people, particularly over the last couple of years, that many of whom have gone through really difficult times. I don't know, and perhaps I don't care at the moment. The reality is, at least we're starting to talk about it. But we have to talk about it in a much more joined up way, rather than thinking about, and I don't know what it's like over in Clayton Oots, Julio, but once you have a well-being director or a health and safety director, there is a danger that people in that organization think that the well-being of the whole organization is the responsibility of that individual. We see it with D&I, where you will ask law firms and they will point you to their D&I partner to say that that director is the person responsible for D&I in this organization. Well, that can't be right. It can't be right that an individual has responsibility for the well-being of everyone across the organization. Otherwise, I really will get imposter syndrome, Julio, if you're managing to do that. But how do we create that framework for people to then follow and adapt? And so, again, we have that responsibility across the organization.
And Julio, I know you've spoken to this point, and we co-penned an article together on this. So I know that where we talked about the need for there need to be that crossing into different domains, so it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of one particular area. But did you want to talk to that point at all? I mean, in light of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, when we have successes and within the organization, it's not, and where I've been able to contribute or support the organization in achieving that success, it hasn't been my success. It's been the firm's success in us achieving that. I'm merely an instrument or a tool to support the organization in being able to achieve that success wholeheartedly. And that is done through an integrated approach. And, as we kind of go with, as the ways of working continue to change, the cognitive performance of workers is fast becoming a source of competitive advantage. And to be able to leverage that, we have to have that integration of human and systems together. And that does become quite difficult because you're looking at different elements and different business units and practice groups working together. And similar to that, each practice group has its own KPIs in which it's been measured on success of. So how do you then integrate your, I guess, objectives and goals within theirs? And as part of that, where we've been able to have quite a key success within the organization is we've had the opportunity to really sit down with our board, with our senior leadership team, and provide not only education, but also have the ability to do that appreciative inquiry with them, for them to understand what is wellbeing mean to them, and how do they see the aspect of leveraging wellbeing or the impact that we have from a social element across the organization, and what that means, and then how do we then structure our strategy to integrate into that. And it's been a 3-year journey, and it's a long way to continue to do, but we are making those positive steps. And within that, we're tackling some of those archaic mindsets within the legal industry.
They don't exist. I don't know what you're talking about.
But one of the key elements is looking at how do we leverage the systems, and that's looking at the processes and procedures, and sometimes that's reducing what we would call safety clutter. Having a process for the sake of process doesn't actually lead to reducing harm. Sometimes, if anything, it just creates another process in which people have to navigate, work around, or increases the time that they're spending in trying to do the work that they're wanting to do. And the other element is leveraging technology. You know, the way technology is improving within the legal industry, and as within that, obviously means that we're all accessible at all times of day, but obviously leveraging that technology to actually benefit the health of our employees, or reducing the time spent on perhaps less meaningful task, and making sure that they can focus on perhaps more the important tasks, reducing their workload or administrative burden as part of that. But probably where we've had that and our success has been key integration across all business units, and that this isn't my responsibility, this is our responsibility. Our team is here to be able to support you on how do you actually achieve that within the context of your team, but also working towards both, you know, financial gain, but also focusing on those non-financial elements which, you know, contribute and perhaps go more to the social, the community element, which gives our people meaning and purpose in the work that they do, the work and the people that they work with.
No, that's great. And I like how you even talk about the fact that you've arrived at this through that appreciative inquiry, because you're really eliciting that buy-in and getting people in positions of leadership to actually understand, you know, what are the objectives, what are the outcomes they're seeking to achieve. And then that integration, I think, is probably going to be far more effective then if they're able to appreciate, well, what is our purpose in doing this as well. So I think it's really interesting. Great comment that Nick's popped in the chat here as well around technology also being used for whistleblowing, which believes in tandem with harsher consequences. And it's like you already knew what I was about to ask there, Nick. I wanted to flip across to Dan. Dan touched on purpose before, and there's a lot of talk about sustainable workplaces. And we know, Dan, there's a link between being a sustainable, purpose-driven business and being a profitable one as well at the same time. We know that having a purpose with which your clients can connect is going to help to create that reputational value, but it also impacts the financial return. And exactly what Nick's talking about as well, we're starting to see this more with the advent of employee activism. So I was listening to a session recently where it said the new leaking is the new whistleblowing now, and I think that's really accelerated, since certain events that we've seen. The death of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement as well that we've seen. So talking about purpose here as well, can you tell us a little bit about what purpose means in the context of a law firm, why it matters? Do we think that organisations could potentially be purpose washing? And should organisations really be looking at this with a really focused lens? Because if we know that there is this rise of employee activism, corporations don't control the media anymore. It's at the touch of a smartphone fingertip to actually release this information about what's actually going on in the organisation and their commitment to a certain value or purpose there. So could you talk to us a bit about that, Dan?
Yeah, I think the big challenge here, where to start, right? So, What we know, corporates are very much looking now at stakeholder benefits as much as shareholder profits now. So from a starting point, where many of the CEOs of some of the largest organizations got together in 2019 and started putting really high on the agenda this suggestion of stakeholder profit, it will feed through, right? It will feed through to many of the organizations if such big CEOs in those organizations are talking about responsible business in such an emphatic way. So I know from the corporates I've worked in, and my colleagues I know from the various ones they have in-house, that it's embedded in terms of those organizations, particularly the operational side of the businesses and the supply chains that they work with. It's part of the fabric of the organization that the purpose and values are lived and breathed. Certainly it should be in any authentic organization. And Patagonia is a great example recently that we saw announcing a significant change in the structure and of how where their profits are going to be distributed. But they've always been an organization that has believed in its cause and been very authentic. And that has had an incredible business benefit for them reputationally, and therefore people buying their product. Now, again, the cynic might say, well, this is all so that they could continue to then attract people and make more money. But do you know what? In some respects, you've almost got to put the cynicism to one side if you are that case, because if it's having a win-win outcome, let's go with it.
Sure.
And that's what I say to a lot of the law firms that I've worked with in the past. I'm not sure how authentic purpose is or values are. I see them written on the walls of law firm offices. But do I genuinely believe that if I asked 50% of their people, they could tell me what the 4 values of their organization were? I imagine not. So if buyers of services now, certainly in the UK, it's a £50 billion a year industry, the legal service industry. Buyers of services will start to think differently about how they choose the providers they're going to work with based on values, purpose, ethics, and everything else. Because that's what their organizations that they work in are doing and talking about. That's what they're doing, collaborating with supply chains in other operational areas. So that will eventually feed through to the way in which legal services are purchased as well. Now, the term ESG is featuring in the tenders at the moment, Wellbeing, of course, being part of that. But we're not really seeing a shift in the dial when it comes to the profession. In fact, I almost think it's going to go the other way at the moment. If you see how much these salaries are being escalated in the UK and in America, and I'm sure similarly in Australia, we're seeing newly qualified lawyers now achieving salaries that were unthinkable for someone senior in the organization 10 years ago. Now, with that salary increase must come higher expectation. It must mean that we are on the one hand saying we care about your well-being, but now we expect more from you on the other hand. The two just don't sit hand in hand for me. Now, if I'm looking at an organization from a responsible business perspective, and I genuinely care about the supply chain I use, I'm questioning whether or not the suppliers we use are saying one thing and doing another. And as a buyer, I should be, and I want all of our general counsel peer groups I talk to and engage with as part of O-Shape to start saying, do we have a responsibility now in terms of who we buy services from? Just because people are being paid a lot of money doesn't mean they're entitled to be burnt out. So as a buyer of this £50 billion industry in the UK, what responsibility did I have that my colleagues now have in how they buy services? And am I contributing to people being burnt out, falling over as a result of the increased capacity that people are being asked to meet? That for me is where we can start to see purpose, values, mission play a real role in improving outcomes within the profession more broadly.
And a very good point that you make. I was reading an article recently by the City Mental Health Alliance that actually talked about the fact that, having a workplace mental health and wellbeing strategy with plans and actions, from that is what's going to, the key measures for investors looking to assess risk in business and then ultimately investing. So from that is what's then going to flow on. It drives the happiness and wellbeing and outcomes that are good for business, which then helps to create that employee wellbeing, which is that wellbeing capital, which will then improve the employee performance, employee retention, reduced absenteeism, and all of the other aspects that we see that are derived from that too, which builds the social capital, which makes the social impact. So there is a really interesting sort of connection between all of those. So in terms of the purpose then, like what should organisations be doing then? I mean, I read an article that you wrote and released, I've got it here actually, in fact, Pioneers, Purpose and Profit there, Dan. You talk about North Star. Should organisations aligning or finding their North Star, because that's what's going to obviously, help to attract that talent, and also then align the values with both employees, but also with the investors that and the stakeholders that are wanting to get involved with that business.
If it's authentic, Desi, would be my response, right? So let's not put out there a grand purpose to attract the next generation of talent who are interested and care about purpose if it's not something that's then translated into practice. And I think it's a real struggle. I have some sympathy for the law firms here in comparison to the in-house, as I mentioned earlier, because how are you attracting people with that purpose approach? I think it's also a real opportunity as well as being a challenge, because there is such a war on talent that what are the differentiators at the moment? We've placed it as money being the key differentiator, and that salary is getting higher and higher. But we know that, and research shows that's a very short-term approach and not sustainable going forward. What will really attract the next generation in is to know how they're valued as people, to know that the work they're doing is contributing to a better all-round society, and that they're working on matters that are genuinely making a difference to their clients. That, I think, will give them real meaning and purpose in their work. So how do you define that purpose? There are some firms who are genuinely looking inward and saying, do we have a purpose that we should be defining? But I want those organizations to look outward much more and look at what organizations outside the legal industry do and say, what impact can we have on society more broadly? The last 3 years have seen incredible profits at law firms, right? Well, all around them have fallen by the wayside during the pandemic and the health and economic challenges that has brought. I'm all up for people making money, by the way. Don't think for 1 minute I'm not suggesting responsible capitalism. But wouldn't it be great if firms could say that we're going to contribute towards other really important goals rather than simply every year drain the equity pot, which is how the partnership deeds now require people to do, is to take their money out every year. Because that's then starting to say that we're thinking about the next generation who are going to be the guardians of this firm that we are currently the guardians of, as opposed to suck all the value out of it while I'm in a leadership position, which is what people are incentivized to do at the moment. So we're not talking about tweaking around the edges if we're talking about purpose. We are talking culturally about a whole different style and approach to the way in which these organizations are run. And that means you need to start looking at the foundational documents, the partnership deeds that start to dictate how those partnerships operate. They need to be looked at again. If anyone's going to genuinely believe that firms are up for it rather than just having a well-being seminar or bringing in a motivational speaker to talk about purpose, that is purpose washing, if that's the right
Absolutely.
phrase.
Right term.
What is real would be those firms that say we're going to go from grassroots up. We're going to look at changing everything we do and putting a purpose lens on it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we are not for profit. That doesn't mean that we're not in any way seeking to capitalize on the great stuff we are doing. It just means that we're profit for purpose, if you like. So we can still make, and in fact, looking at the Patagonia example, they can make even more money than they ever imagined possible whilst doing something really good. How about that?
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. You've spoken right to my heart there, Dan, as well. And, I've got a grand interest in the social impact piece. Interesting that you pointed out, purpose, and there are some firms that are really articulating that. And I think in that article that you co-wrote as well, there was Alistair Morrison pointed out really looking at 3 adjectives and from there trying to derive some kind of a code of firm DNA that presumably, I was saying, responds to the context, the purpose of that organisation. But absolutely responsible capitalism, as you rightly said, there's nothing wrong with that. But definitely I come at it from a lens too by saying, well, what is the purpose of business? Like, what are we here to do? We've got our, Larry Fink, his letter in really trying to articulate the impacts on the community as well. But that is where we should start looking. We obviously are looking at the partner profitship model, which I'm going to talk to you in just a moment about, but looking at what is the greater impact on society as well. What are we seeking to achieve? And the endpoint of social impact is trying to put people in a position where they're going to be able to lead a life of value and achieve some level of well-being. If somebody can argue against me, I mean, I'm more than welcome to bring on the debate, but I think subjectively, we are all, that is the one goal we all have in common, that we are trying to achieve some level individually or as a corporation, some level of either organisation or individual well-being. What that looks like from jurisdiction to jurisdiction will look significantly different, but looking at that and defining what that impact is, defining what our outcomes that we're seeking to achieve is really important. And I like the fact that there are some organisations doing that. Let's switch now. I want to talk about social impact. Then I want to come back to this partner profit model here as well. Julio, I did want to talk a little bit about social impact. It's often said what's measured is treasured. I know that you do have a grand interest in measurement as well. We know obviously that wellbeing is a critical determinant of talent attraction. We've talked about that Dan referred to as well. Also retention, as well as the material pillar of ESG analysis, and also performance assessment, but it's also been criticised and agreed by many economists that GDP is not really a comprehensive measure of productivity and or success, really, for that matter. Tell me a little bit about measurement. How does it fit in striving towards these sustainable work practices, and potentially even if we're trying to vie towards these sustainable development goals? What are your thoughts on considering social impact as an imperative to corporate social responsibility? How should we be doing this in organisations? And what are we doing at Clayton?
I guess, where to begin in relation to that? I mean, I think what is measured is treasured. I definitely agree because, but funnily enough, obviously, if we looked at most reporting standards, there hasn't been any specific metrics in which organisations are utilizing to go, how do we measure the impact that we're having from a social lens under the ESG element? And part of that is, I think, because organizations don't know how to be able to leverage the data that's currently available to them. And in part of this, obviously, when we look at it from a social lens, that it comes down to people, is there's an element of privacy and confidentiality that we still need to be able to maintain. Now, I think there's numerous different elements of metrics that we can be able to leverage to understand the impact that we're having, or the work that is the impact work is having for your employees. And that can be a traditional, whether it's workers' compensation, number of workers that are under workers' compensation claims, the number of mental health claims that you're by the source of harm, whether absenteeism, presenteeism, use your employee engagement survey data, there's trust in leaderships. I think there's numerous ways in which you could probably look to understand what is the impact that the work that you're doing within the organization is having on your people. And I think, within that is starting to understand the organizational and cultural staff engagement element. And as mentioned, there is a survey such as the psychological safety climate with a PSC 12 to understand what is the psychological climate within your organization, to understand the impact that your leadership is having. That's predominantly focused on the leadership and your systems process if you're using the PSC 12. But similar to that, your pulse surveys, exit surveys, general wellbeing surveys within the organization are all data points which you're able to leverage and actually utilize as a point of measurement. And similar to what was mentioned by Nick in the comments, the number of complaints and disputes to HR, whether it's from a bullying or sexual harassment element as well. So, I mean, where we're starting is that we started to begin as saying, what is the data that's available to us? And what story does that data tell? Because you can always, one thing with data is you can always skew it positively to tell the story that you want it to, or you can use the data to tell a different story. And that kind of might be depending on who is kind of driving the ship at that point in time. So our point in time was to leverage the data, what we had, and we did a historical review over 5 years to look at what was the journey over 5 years and what occurred over that period of time, and what did we see what hadn't we seen, what didn't the data tell us? And one element is, if we looked at one data point, is looking at that we didn't have a significant number of attrition. Our employees stayed with the organisation. Our average tenure is over 10 years plus. But that can be skewed in a manner that's a positive sign. People are loving the working for Clayton Utes, or it could also be in a different way that, individuals that perhaps are just disengaged but aren't wanting to move on, and that may be as a result of not being able to find a role that's remunerated accordingly to the same extent what they're current to. Not saying that's the case here, but we use the data to be able to kind of understand what is the story it's telling us, but more importantly, what is it not telling us, and where do we actually need to focus our energy to be able to get the information that we require to kind of go, where does the strategy need to go? Where are there initiatives and programs having to take a focus on? So we lose both our EAP data, our private health insurance, salary continuance, workers' compensation data, engagement surveys, wellbeing check-ins, go with our Caffeine Connect, where we have people just having general conversations with each other, our whistleblower information, presenteeums, absenteeums, hours worked, billable hours, and finally, some of the things that Dan was referring to, where we're seeing from an insurance lens, is they no longer are looking at how many PI claims we're having, but what are we doing to support the well-being of our people? And by having a healthier workforce, we're less likely to have PI claims, therefore we're less likely to have a premium impacting, therefore next year our premiums are less likely to increase, which I think, over the last 2 years, we've probably seen an increase over 20% in PI insurances across the legal industry. And to be able to leverage, be able to tell a story that the impact that we're having from a social element across our employees reduces the likelihood of that is one avenue in which not only our supply chains, but in this instance, insurers are looking at to try and, determine whether they increase premiums by X percent or reduce premium by X percent as well. Probably didn't answer your question directly there. Sorry, Desi.
No, not at all. But no, from what you're basically saying then is it looks as though there needs to be an implementation of a system and a longitudinal type system that's measuring it over a period of time. And I think for some organisations, they probably don't have the capabilities that Clayton Utes has. So perhaps, it's a situation of just sitting down at first instance and having a conversation with their people, but also then, monitoring the wellbeing of their people through, obviously, there's probably some more basic types of assessment tools that they could be using, rather than jumping to conclusions and drawing inferences. And I think that's how I've always read into it. Sometimes we think that we know what the solution is, but we don't actually know what's driving the wellbeing needs of our people in an organisation. And I think without measuring that, I don't know how you feel about that as well, Kayne. But called you Kayne, Dan. So the other way around. I have a friend called Kayne, so that's perhaps why. But Dan, without actually, I said, I think perhaps what we do and what we tend to do is we sort of jump to conclusions about what we think is the solution, rather than actually sitting down, actively listening, and working out what's actually driving wellbeing in the organisation, and then responding to those needs accordingly. How do you think about that? And with O-Shaped Lawyer, can you talk to that point at all?
So O-Shape really is about providing the right skill sets for lawyers to be able to thrive and legal professionals to be able to thrive, use all of their talents to be able to really drive a change across the profession. And so I come back to, are we giving people the right skill sets to be able to be great leaders ultimately in our profession? The problem is lawyers think they can do everything, right? So lawyers think that they can, if they needed to, they could perform open heart surgery. I think that there's a need to be able to balance expectations of what lawyers can and should be doing and the skills that they need to achieve that. So what do I mean by that with this question in mind? I think that the responsibility that we come back to here when it comes to well-being is a shared one. Lawyers need to learn the capabilities to be able to spot the signs and be able to support and enable as we go forward. But if we are going to really have well-being as a genuine metric, something that can be measured is of fundamental importance to our organization, and we train and develop people is one thing. We do some purpose washing with the odd wellbeing webinar is another. But if we're generally doing it, we need to incentivize people differently. Okay, so at the moment, the incentivization model is one of bill as much as you can, bring in the most profit, you take home the most money. And if money is your main factor, in terms of success, then that drives everything. Okay, so well-being will always only be secondary until you can convince people that healthy and well people will increase the bottom line and improve the bottom line. But because we look so short-term at things, because we take things on an annual basis, we take out our money, a big investment in people, their well-being, their development, their training. I see this with the training environment and the development environment and the learning and development programs we're bringing to life. That's a long-term investment. Now, that long-term investment for someone that only has a short period of leadership or guardianship of the equity is thinking, why do I need to start investing in something I am not going to see the benefit of in future years? There's a brilliant Greek proverb that I've been quoting left, right, and center, which is about, it says, society grows when old men, let's call them leaders, society grows when old men or leaders plant trees, the shade of which they'll never sit in, which I love.
That is my favorite, very much so.
There you go. So we share the same interest in Greek proverbs, Desi. That's what it is. Now, we're not an environment where people are going to plant trees and not sit. They're not going to be doing this. This is about seeing, for the moment, it's about making sure you're planting whatever trees grow the quickest so you can benefit from the shade. So you're going to be planting super growing trees. We're not thinking more sustainably and saying, what's our role much more broadly in society? Because we're incentivized to be greedy when it comes to what good looks like. Now, if we could say that partners' remuneration would be based on the engagement, well-being, and health of their people, all of a sudden, what gets measured is treasured, or we say what gets measured gets managed, you would find a very different approach to how well-being became the focus. But unfortunately, investing in well-being doesn't bring in more fees. So how do we find the balance between saying partners who have all-round better performance from their team, however you measure performance, but not just money, they have a healthier, engaged team, they have clients that speak volumes about them, and they have, more importantly, their peers and the rest of their organizations that speak really fondly and highly of them, they get the best cut when it comes to splitting the pot at the end of the year. That's how change gets driven. And at the moment, who is going to be the first organization to say we pay our partners based on ESG, D&I, well-being, whatever it is, as well as revenue coming in? I think there are people tweaking around the edges, but fundamentally a business model change is what would be required to achieve that.
No, I'd completely agree with you as well there, Dan. And look, from an ethical standing point, they shouldn't always be a business case for doing the right thing. But you very rightly pointed out the fact that there is this very much a short-term way of viewing things, and that leaders need to be viewing it from the long term, but also the intangible. And I think, if we're looking at, back in the 20th century, most corporate value was really in physical, tangible value, whether that was like cash, plant, machinery. And today we know that 90% of corporate value is intangible. So whether that's R&D, whether that's reputation, stakeholder trust. So, then we need to really be shifting that focus now for the particular landscape that we're in now as well. Looking at how we build trust, how we build that social purpose, how we get that competitive advantage. But yeah, most definitely that business model really needs to change. On that really quickly as well, before we ask, just in the interest of time, when we're talking about this partnership model, and I know you put something on social media that I think I liked yesterday around the partner profit model, partnership profit model. Are you sort of seeing any notable changes in the current business models? I mean, I was reading something recently that said that it's only really, I think it was the Solicitors Regulation Authority, said that the proportion of firms operating under the traditional partnership model has more than halved over the decade to 2021, I think it was, so to a mere 14%. But are you sort of seeing any sort of sizable shifts more recently?
So there are movements away into more listings on markets, but I don't think anyone would say yet with enough backing that they've been a successful approach. I think that I'm not disputing that the partnership model works for the partners, right? It's set up, and partnerships are set up for the benefit of the partnerships. They've grown to such an extent that one can easily say now that they are not suitable because it requires so many of them to make decisions. What I would say is I've met so many great leaders of law firms over the last couple of years who genuinely do care about this stuff. But when their hands are tied in the same way as a CEO's hands wouldn't be tied in a corporation, and an executive that would consist of lots of diverse groups, I would hope, of thinking, would come to decisions that are then applied across the organization. You don't have that same diversity of thought and leadership at law firms, which is largely lawyers making the decisions. But I do think that there is the right attitude and leadership at law firms, but it's so hard to push anything through, because anything that doesn't increase the ROI or the profitability is going to be voted down by the rest of the partnership, which means that you're always going to have this short-term view. So if the partnership model is going to persist, because I know a lot of people are moving away from it, we're not going to see that from the big players. And I think the big four have got a partnership model that works differently and can work differently. I think it's much more about the behaviors. I think it's much more about mindset and behaviors within the structure that we've got. I think I said about the billable hour yesterday. This at the moment is the structure that we have got. Yes, we would like to change it, but let's not use these things as an excuse not to change things. The partnership structure is there. Can you change with the partnership structure? Of course you can. If you've got the right people with the right mindset, seeing that the incentives are in place to do something different, of course you can. But we choose to look at these things and say it's in the too difficult box. Let's just keep going. And frankly, I call out to lots of the clients that spend the money on the law firms, that keep fueling and funding the success of law firms, and say, how do you want to make sure you leave your imprint when it comes to planting trees? How do you want to ensure that your legacy is one where you can say, hand on heart, you bought legal services responsibly? If you care about that, then there's an opportunity to drive change. If you don't, and you keep spending £600 an hour on newly qualified lawyers, which is now where it's got to in the UK, apparently, then we're going to continue to be where we always have been.
Yeah, and I love that, Dan, as well. I think I did a social media post a while back using that exact quote and proverb, I should say, myself as well. But really, it's about that human-centric approach and really having an economy that's in service of the human rather than the other way around. And I think that's what the piece is.
Why wouldn't you?
So that's
right? Why wouldn't you? Everyone's human. They've all got families. Right. They've all got, whether it's kids or whether it's parents, everyone's got one of them somewhere. And, we all have to recognize that there is a slightly bigger picture out there. And you can work yourself to the bone or have others work to the bone and drop down dead the next day. What's the point, frankly? So there is a much bigger question here about what matters to people. And that one is more existential. So I'm not even going to start to kick it off right now, but it does beg the question. Do people step back
definitely. Well, I think it actually sort of touches on the last question I wanted to ask you both. And really, we know obviously that there is that growing body of evidence that shows ethical companies outperforming financially over time, ones that aren't. But there's also, as I was saying, a dueling train of thought that, ESG is about ethics. I really wanted to look at sort of the ethics piece behind that. And we've acknowledged these data sets by looking at the financial benefits and costs of ethical initiatives through measurement and assessment that you referred to as well before, Julio. They're critical in shaping the decision-making. But can you talk to the fundamental importance of business integrity? So what Dan was talking about around purpose and obviously these changes to these business models aren't going to come into effect until there's a significant mindset shift where people are actually valuing what matters most. And ultimately that is going to be the well-being of its people. So can you talk to that piece around business integrity and ethical leadership in really sort of championing this and their organisations for the sustainability of the future legal operations?
I think raising the profile of ethical decision making in an organisation is critical. Unless we see individuals or groups in the organisation perceiving elements of ESG, health, safety, well-being to be ethical dilemmas, then they won't intentionally make ethical judgments or form ethical intentions and ultimately make ethical decisions. So it's how do we do that? I think it's a difficult one. And I think Dan was kind of hitting the nail on the head. It's kind of up to individual leaders that we are seeing that put value on this. And it's not so much about the return of investment, but the value of investment that we are putting on these programs and initiatives or valuing our employees to be people, not to be a number that results in profits that ultimately, as we need an organization to stay financially profitable, to be able to continue servicing its clients and hopefully having a positive social impact within its community and society and anyone that's impacted by their undertakings, but needs to be done in a manner that those ethical decisions can build trust. And if there's a decision that made supporting, that perhaps is not supported across the board, providing justification can lead to at least trust in explaining those decisions that are often necessary to also describe the subcultures of an organization's functional groups. So I think within that, there's languages or barriers to overcome within the organization, internally in the organization, because again, the value that certain leaders or practice or partners bestow on well-being will vary based on individual experiences, or the circumstances in which they've been exposed to throughout their career, or more so what they've been exposed to on a personal level as well. So it's one that I think I think ethics and morality need to come into play, and as we've seen with Patagonia, the impact that has had. Whether there was a financial tax benefit to the founder, that's a different story. But obviously, regardless, they have had a positive impact within the community. So I think for us, it is looking at how does ethics play into that. And from our, if we're looking at organizations that have, we have a zero harm to health and safety, or we have zero appetite for risk in relation to health and safety, you have to question that, because automatically you have people working overtime. So you do have an appetite.
Right. So there's that sort of incongruence there, isn't it? You can't sort of profess one thing and say, yes, we profess that there's, to have a zero harm approach, but then, as you rightly said, that they have these risks in terms of overworking and under-resourcing, and then that sort of is that incongruency and sort of disconnecting what is profit in the organisation, what's actually taking place.
Yes. No, so yeah, I mean, it's an interesting place to see how the legal industry begins to make those ethical decisions in relation to how the structure, but more so how work is done, the work they do, and the people that they work with long term, in ensuring that they become a law firm that is admired, not only both internally but also externally.
Well, that's exactly right. An organisation best practice, the one that actually looks after its people, and that will obviously come down to prioritising the long term over and the long term and the intangible to some extent over the short term and the tangible as well. On that particular point, that's what I was going to ask you.
I'd love to have some of the transparency. We won't get it, but if you imagine at a law firm, if we're talking about doing the right thing, there must be a correlation. He says, having absolutely no basis for this other than just my instinct. There must be a correlation between firms that raise our targets and salaries and the well-being of their people. I imagine that the higher the hours, the higher the pay, the more people who suffer from mental health and burnout issues. And Julio's nodding, and I'm going to go with your expertise on that, Julio. So that means that the decision makers at firms that are pushing up the salaries, who are pushing up the hours, are making a conscious decision to say, we know that this is going to hurt people. We know it's going to hurt our people, but we still think it's the right thing to do. Now, ethical leaders are making that balance between we need to be profitable, we need to attract the best people, but we recognize there's an impact on that. How do we best manage that impact on that? Because I'm not suggesting businesses shouldn't grow, by the way. So how do you grow in a responsible way? Because as far as I can see, it's growing irresponsibly at the moment. And that is simply people who I think are good human beings saying, we recognize that there will be collateral from what we're doing, but we can live with that because we're making more money. Now, I'd love to be around a board table when that conversation is happening. Unfortunately, I haven't yet been invited. I doubt now I will ever get invited. But that's where surely the decisions have to be taken in an auditable, sensible way, where firms are saying, we recognize that more money and more hours is going to have an impact. Here is how we are mitigating and managing that impact. And this is why ultimately we think in the longer term, we are going to have better paid, more healthy, happier people, and our profitability will increase. The two do not have to be mutually exclusive, but they need to be managed very differently.
Yeah.
No, and look, yes. Yeah, Julio, from you?
Sorry, I was going to say that then goes into the element of governance through the ESG, like both from what are the safety assurances or the assurances in relation to the mitigation measures that organizational law firms have in place around the reducing the likelihood of an injury or illness taking effect? And then how does that then feed into their safety governance framework and their broader governance framework, and then feeds into officer due diligence, both from a safety, but then more broadly from a corporation element. And if that's within their risk tolerance and within their risk appetite, and they have trust in the assurances, then it's something that I guess it'd be time will tell on the impact that that will potentially have across the board within the legal industry more wholeheartedly.
And look, I think you rightly addressed it there, Julio, that it very much is a governance issue. But ultimately, I think the question was around the fact as well that lawyers are held to such high ethical standards. Should they really be championing, this? And should we be looking at it from an ethical standing point as a starting point rather than from a risk management perspective? Because it's often been said, and you and I have had that conversation that sometimes by the time risk sort of eventuates, often too late to prevent them. You can use the example of that through how a company treats its workers. I mean, if you consider these things as potentially reputational risks, something becomes that reputational risks because people care because of ethical reasons. So people do feel it's unethical, and that's why I think it's so important then that the starting piece is really around impact and ethics, and really trying to educate through what you're doing there with O-Shaped as well, Dan. I'm presuming there's a component of ethical leadership and what that looks like for people to some extent as well, and trying to articulate that.
It is. Look, it's not, we don't call it ethical leadership. We talk about the leadership capabilities. And one of those leadership capabilities is being able to have the right conversations to make the right decisions. And what's the right decisions for one person at the moment is probably very different from what the right decisions are for another. But you're right to go back to the ethical element of it and say, can we not, as a profession, just do the right thing? And it's simple as that. And if we think the balance of harm against good is the wrong way, then let's not do it.
No, exactly right. Well, we are 2 minutes off 7:30, so I did want to ask you for some of your final words to wrap up the session. But I mean, what do you think organisations should be doing at the very sort of preliminary sort of way to address it? What should be some of the things that organisations should do in relation to addressing the wellbeing needs of their people? Julio, I'll start with you first.
I think the first place to start, which is not always the easiest, is communication. Communicate with your employees from the ground root up and top down to understand what are their needs, how are they actually traveling, because without communicating and understanding and having that contextualizing within organization, and I know you can always look at benchmarking, but again, within benchmarking across the board, each organization's context is different. So benchmarking is only so valuable to an extent. So I think for me, it's that it's starting at the very beginning of communicating and trying to understand. And within that communication piece is looking at the different subcultures or working or cultures, or the diversity within your organization, both from different cultural backgrounds or cultural and linguistically diverse groups, but also age groups, and taking that across the employee and partner life cycle. What are their needs as they progress from going from a graduate to a partner to retirement, and how can we best support them through each of those stages and develop them to ensure that they continue having a positive impact of the health benefits of good work within the legal industry.
So you can really lead to that sustainability of practice. Dan, you got about 30 seconds.
Just to close, I'm conscious of time. So my one thing would be put people first. O-Shapes talks about people first. If we start to make decisions with people very much front and center, we'll find we're making much better decisions in the long run. Not surprising, you look after your people, they'll look after your customers, and profitability will come. So that would be my message.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. And ending it on the lovely Marriott note, and ultimately that's what it's about. It's about looking after your people who will then look after your clients and the community. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank both Dan and Julio for their wonderful insights this evening. We hope that you gained equally a lot of insights from what we were saying, and you can take some of these strategies into your workplaces. We'd like to also thank Rasmi and also Nick for the opportunity this evening, and wish you all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.